So I am Dr. Nteri Nelson, and I am co-founder of the Academy of Kemetic Education and Wellness. And I have previously served as adjunct professor in Africana Studies at the University of Massachusetts in Boston. And I have previously served as the representative for Eastern Region ASCAC, Massachusetts representative, and on the Spiritual Commission. Okay, so, and I am a metaphysician, a teacher, and a clinician. Today's presentation is entitled Race and Consciousness. And this research from my book, Secrets of Race and Consciousness, examines expansion in planetary consciousness, developmental stages beyond white supremacy and racism, and the role African consciousness must play. And you see the book, Secrets of Race and Consciousness, in the first slide, and as well as other books that I have authored. Presently, the consciousness of our Earth humanity is an admixture of African, Semitic, Asiatic, and European peoples, which correspond to the three seeming racial types that inhabit our planet and comprise our one human family. Carvings by our African ancestors from the tomb of Ramesses III, 1200 BCE, depict these three distinct racial types, portraying the Nubians and Kemites as identical, and Indo-Europeans and Semites as profoundly different in physical appearance. These three primary races are likewise described in the pyramid text and Medjugorje language as Nehesu, Amu, and Tamahu. Other common descriptive terms also include Negroid, Mongolian, and Caucasian. Now, esoterically, these are also called the third, fourth, and fifth root races, with the third, African, being ancient and elder, and the fifth, Aryan, European, Caucasian, being recent and younger. These three root races that are now overlapping combine to form a consciousness admixture described in this research as 3, 4, 5 African, Semitic, Aryan consciousness admixture. This talk will reference these three seeming racial types by name, by number, and by states of consciousness. Now, why number and consciousness? The Kemites, later called the Egyptians, have given us the septenary, or 7 planes of consciousness, for understanding our journey both celestially and spiritually and terrestrially in our earthly material manifestation. These 7 planes of consciousness likewise correspond with the 7 soul bodies in our constitution or makeup as man and woman, which is both human and divine. Through the law of correspondence, the septenary, or the 7, informs us that there are 7 root races which unfold on our planet against the backdrop of a specific cycle in time. Now, currently, only the 3rd, 4th, and 5th root races are simultaneously fully visible and running their course of unfoldment on the planet, which we easily encounter today in any diverse urban subway station. The 1st and 2nd root races were a more ethereal, subtle, and amorphous godlike form, and therefore there is not the material, substantive evidence that gives them appearance on our planet. The 6th and 7th root races, which have yet to make their full appearance, are referenced in my book, but are beyond the scope of today's presentation. We already see evidence of this, but it is beyond the scope. Now, even though the third, fourth, and fifth root races that have unfolded at this time have certain physiological characteristics and geographical histories, our focus here is more about particular states of consciousness, how these are blending together at this time in our Earth history and influence this world period. What we must come to terms with is the fact that each root race has its respective part to play in the great divine plan. God consciousness indwells within skins ranging in hues that are black, brown, red, yellow, and white. However, accordingly to Max Heimdall and Rosicrucian Cosmoconceptions, who states, races are but an evanescent feature of evolution. Races are simply steps in evolution which must be taken. Otherwise, there will be no progress for the spirits reborn in them. This planetary blending of consciousness is what we now confront as a humanity in our next evolutionary and historical steps. Our collective psycho-spiritual journey now leads us to move from an Aryan, European, particulate, separative, and materialization consciousness cycle, a state which now dominates our planet Earth, a state which has been our nadir, or lowest point in material existence, to move now to a consciousness cycle which is unitive, universalizing, synthesizing, and re-spiritualizing, which is our zenith, the most exalted in African consciousness. What have Aryan, European, Egyptologists, and spiritualists stated about this psycho-spiritual journey in unfolding consciousness? First, we must take note that there has been an even greater colonization of things spiritual and celestial, one that rivals the terrestrial or earthly colonization scheme of the Berlin Conference of 1884, 85, and its aftermath. Some Egyptologists and spiritual historians have been more forthright, like Gerald Massey in his works, Ancient Egypt, Light of the World. Others have not. The Secret Doctrine, published in 1888, shortly after our so-called emancipation from bondage, is an at times distorted, garbled compilation attempt at garnering the planetary history of ancient wisdom. We take note that, like Chancellor Williams before him, Robin Walker in his book, When We Rule, points out in research the idea that nearly all material, even if overtly hostile to black people, will often contain juice that can be squeezed out. Therefore, once we lift the veils from an African-centered perspective, as I attempt in the 5 books I have authored, we see that as much as, for example, H.P.V. Blavatsky and others are caught unsaying the greatness of the black race, they are equally caught in the saying of that greatness as evidenced here accordingly in Secret Doctrine. That, quote, that third and holy race, read here, African race, consisted of men who, at their zenith, were described as towering giants of godly strength and beauty, and the depositories of all the mysteries of heaven, and the third race became the vehicle of the Lords of wisdom. This is further stated by Thomas Bougon in his book, The Light of Egypt. Quote, the third race read here, Africans, are the inheritors of the divine wisdom of the gods of the Golden Age. Now, this is later contrasted with the fifth root race, Aryan European, in our planetary history, who make their appearance against the backdrop of a down spiral into a materialization in consciousness time cycle. That Europeans were ordained to plunge the world into its material depths is expressed accordingly by Vera Stanley Adler in her book, Initiation of the World. Quote, civilization moved westward once more. Those branches of the Aryan subraces who were to perform the great feat of taking the deepest, most blinding dip into matter, there to wrestle for its mastery on its own level, without the aid of spiritual insight, were being collected together in the ordained lands, France, Germany, Britain, and many of their neighbors. It is now time for the lowest depths of the material world to be sounded, and having been mastered fairly upon its own level, to be raised and fused with the highest possible spiritual level. Now, today, it is now African people who must lead humanity and Earth's inhabitants out of these depths, back to this highest possible spiritual level. But there is one feat we must accomplish first, herein described. We must understand the cycle of time in which we now live and the qualitative backdrop of energies available to lift us into the Assyrianization of consciousness and the re-spiritualization of our planet. This shift is not personal, but is governed by cycles of time. Just as when we have day, it will shift to night, and night to day again, so too we live in cycles more spiritual, then shifting to cycles more material, then back again. Our African ancestors of the Nile Valley gave us a Kemetic cosmology, cosmogenesis, science, psychology, and spirituality in the pyramid texts and Medu-Neter language for understanding and scaling this spirit-matter continuum, which I write about in my other books, KaAbBa, Building Light Temple, Metaphysical Keys to the Tree of Life, KaAbBa, the Great Pyramid is the Tree of Life, and so on in great detail. Now, how do we move from no-thingness to somethingness? How the Creator creates. Consciousness, the law of vibration. This brings us to the next slide. Thank you. We see in this next slide, in the Medu-Neter, our African ancestors teach us this whole process of creation. They teach us that Ka is spirit, which is represented by the Medu-Neter of the upstretched arms. So Ka as spirit takes of the substance of itself to see itself in form, which is represented by these outstretched arms on the bottom here. Ka, spirit, takes of the substance of itself to see itself in form, like you sitting in these chairs. Ka, spirit, takes of the substance of itself that we have consciousness in form, which is represented by this Medu-Neter, the heart, Ab. And as we become fully conscious, Ab becomes Ba, which is represented by the Medu-Neter of the hawk. The Tree of Life is a symbol or cosmogram of our constitution, both human and divine. And Ba, Ab, Ka correspond with the 3, 4, 5 primary states of consciousness in the Tree of Life, which is shown in the next slide. So we see 3, Ba, is unitive consciousness, universal and synthesizing. 4, Ab, is dualative or dual, reconciling, decision-making, or on a lower spiral can be combative. 5, Ka, is separative in its materializing aspect, or particulate, individualizing, and discriminating. Moreover, each of the 3 seeming primary racial types have contributed to informing these 3 primary states in consciousness. This 3, 4, 5 blending in consciousness heightens awareness and enables us to more clearly see our underlying unity as a planetary family. How do we regain this spiritual insight? It is through the activation of the first eye. And what is the first eye? It is the eye that sees interiorly, located here, before the use of these 2 physical eyes that see exteriorly. And it is the African third root race that are the possessors of this inner sight and beholders of the underlying unity in nature. This power would dim in the later races who would lose this inner-sightedness, which is registered through the power of the first eye. And this is stated accordingly in Secret Doctrine. The possession of a physical third eye, read here, first eye, we are told, was enjoyed by the men of the third root race, read here, African. Psychically and spiritually, however, its mental and visual perceptions lasted till nearly the end of the 4th race, read here, African Semitic, when its functions, owing to the materiality and depraved condition of mankind, died out altogether. So today, we are working to restore and develop and fully activate this first eye. Can we have the next slide? And I always bring this symbol, which I say is of the first eye, this sphere. And it's a symbol of this development is to imagine that we are standing within this sphere. And when we stand within this sphere, we want to hold an awareness, as we hold this awareness within the sphere of this individuated mirrored frame. And we're able to see and hold the awareness of this individuated frame in relationship to that individuated frame, and this individuated mirrored frame in relationship to this individuated mirrored frame, and so on. It is through the first eye that we are able to glimpse the pot represented by each individuated mirrored frame, its relationship with every other part. We are able to behold that simultaneous pot relationship and all at onceness. And we are able to see spherically, moving beyond linear sightedness. Another symbol of this development is to imagine this glass of liquid in the next slide. Just imagine this symbolizes the new, without the boundaries of the glass. The waters of space, the waters of creation, the fount of all possibility, all consciousness. And imagine particles that have reached a saturation point in this whole manifestation process. Particles that have reached a saturation point and falling out of solution, like particles of sugar at the bottom of a glass of lemonade. And imagine each particulate in consciousness symbolizes the seeming self, the I'd or identity that we are, and in relationship to every other seeming self and identity. So certainly in a process of meditation, we're sitting there on our zafu and moving in that state of trance to move beyond just this physicality of the self, or that seeming self. But we must locate that seeming self and have that identity. Our feat as African-centered people is to fully claim ourselves and our families as a particulate in this ocean of creation, symbolized by this glass. Claim the part we have played by telling our story as an African people, our history, telling our African history. We are up here in unitive consciousness in the waters, in that spiritual realm, including all others, forgiving everyone, loving unconditionally. And yes, to love those who have been unlovable is to love unconditionally. This is a major planetary African feat and development as African people. Yet often leaving ourselves out. In a world dominated by white supremacy, those African towers of great strength and beauty now stand in witness to the very day when we would have to affirm the obvious, which is Black Lives Matter. That is like asserting the ocean matters, trees matter. Particulate consciousness asserts I matter. We have a right to assert the part, the self. In our development, we must embrace not just the spirit of black, but the material aspect of blackness, the particulate matter of our lives, and what's the matter in our lives. A world dominated by white supremacy never fails to assert the part. Moreover, a world of white supremacy never fails to assert the lower vibratory stage in this development, which is separative consciousness, which resoundingly asserts only I matter. In our higher initiation, African charge and African agency, we must embrace the part that is the self and retake everything into the self, the all self, the fullness of the one true self as Osir, leaving nothing out, including Black Lives Matter, including Black lives, which would be a distortion in consciousness. We cannot achieve self-negation or selflessness, a higher initiatory state of consciousness, until we have a self and identity to negate. It is a part to embrace, then to transcend. We are overcoming barriers to our own self-love. Self-love is not selfish. Self-love is preparatory to selflessness. We must grasp our particularization, our particular Black Lives Matter, stir ourselves back into solution, back into ma'at in relationship with ourselves, family, fellow Africans, the whole human family, and every kingdom in nature. Ossuritization of consciousness is to be steward of the mineral, vegetable, animal, human, and ancestral kingdoms. Then and only then do we enter our return back into uppercase blackness, access to the fount of all possibility, Aman, the all self, the one true self, universal consciousness. When we come together, we will crest the wave of the now dawning re-spiritualization cycle in consciousness, in that Sankofa, turning into our return, our African zenith. These three primary states, next line, reveal correspondence within the geometric 3-4-5 triangle of the Great Pyramid, where we have access to becoming the full measure of man and woman, which is both human and divine. So in this slide, we see the 3-4-5 triangle and the God men, or the nature men. Our African ancestors gave us this science for becoming the fullest measure of man and woman. And we see the correspondence within the triangle of the divine trinity of Osir, Oset, and Haru. So our African ancestors gave us the triad, or the divine trinity, as well as the septenary, the seven. These three primary states of consciousness combine to form 7 psycho spiritual consciousness types that move us beyond the limited encapsulation of racism, of white supremacy, through which we view, which the self is viewed. And we must come to tell the story, and we will be able to come to tell the story, the full story of the psychospiritual journey in unfolding consciousness. And these 7 psychospiritual types, next slide, please. So we see here in this next slide the unitive, dualative, particulate or separative, how we move from I know that I know, I think that I know, and ways that these types may be combined. So we are working in the restoration of our first I to access that 3rd, 4th, and 5th consciousness, all of those primary states of consciousness. And we might want to just take a moment, I think we don't have it, to just think of who on our planet, who are the men and women who have walked our earth, who have been able to see, behold the part, and simultaneous relationship with all other parts, and walk a walk in my art. We may think out loud about Cheikh Anta Diop. We might think of Harriet Tubman. We might think of Marcus Garvey, and even per Dr. Ama's talk yesterday, if we were thinking about Nelson Mandela, you know, what would be absent that would move him into appropriating more of that 3, 4, 5 blending in consciousness in his walk, in his work in the world. You know, what are demonstrations of those who walk among us, who have and walk with that activated first I in this reconstruction and in unfolding the fullness of who we are as African people. In our outgoing footsteps in populating the world, in this spiritual journey of unfolding consciousness, in this scattering of the body of Osir, in this things fall apart of Chinwe, Achebe, we are now living in times with melting polar ice caps and global warming conditions, times opposite when we left with our outgoing footsteps to populate the world, with frozen polar ice caps and increasing drought in Africa. Our feat today in making our return journey is to pull ourselves back together again, our African zenith. Ashe. I am Dr. Nteri Nelson, and I am co-founder of the Academy of Kemetic Education and Wellness, a metaphysician, an educator, and a clinician. And the presentation you just saw was entitled Race and Consciousness, African Zenith, and it is based on the research in my book, Secrets of Race and Consciousness. And what I most wanted this presentation to convey is the importance of African consciousness, African-centered consciousness, and what does that mean? What is the unfoldment and the demonstration of that? African people are the possessors of the first I, and this is such an important symbol that I use to represent that first I. And that first I is located here
between the eyebrows. And it is the eye that sees interiorly and has the power to know and behold the underlying unity throughout creation. It precedes the development of these two physical eyes that see outwardly, exteriorly. And that power to know may be understood in terms of a type of sightedness. That first sightedness or awareness that we are possessing is the ability to know the pot, to know, symbolized here as to stand in the center of this sphere and to imagine being able to see and behold this individuated mirrored frame, to have an awareness of that and hold that in consciousness, and to hold that in relationship with this individuated mirrored frame, and to hold that in relationship with this individuated mirrored frame, and so on. And through that relating, we become aware of these myriad perspectives, myriad ways of beholding what is happening in the world around us. And as we are able to behold the pot in relationship to every other pot, then we are developing a consciousness of the pot, the relationship of one at a timeness and simultaneous all at onceness. And that all at onceness is spherical consciousness. And like typically what we used to see, even in the nightly news, is we would see one perspective. You'd see one person standing there giving one perspective. And now what they do when something happens in the news is they bring on a panel of people and you hear the various perspectives. And that's sort of a little micro template of what I'm talking about and how we need to expand that. And one of the ways to expand the ability to see more fully, the ability to activate the first eye within a room, is to make sure everyone is represented that can bring that perspective, that can bring that spherical sidedness and awareness that needs to come and to stand in the center of that. So if we're in a meeting, a grouping, and we are able to bring everyone into that conversation and be able to hold that awareness, and then the simultaneous all-at-onceness of that, then we're able to move out and find solutions to the life's problems.
Okay, now the question that I have is that you're talking a lot about unity and diversity, but at the same time we're in an environment that presently that is counter to that.
Yes.
Everything is divided and shoved against each other. How does this, for lack of a theoretical idea, work in practical terms in combating what we're living in now?
Yes. And so what I also talked about is how, as an African people, this great race, and I quoted in that presentation that even European Egyptologists and spiritualists have said as much, that we are in a moment now where we have to assert that Black life matters. How absurd. That's like, as I said in the presentation, asserting the ocean matters or trees matter, that this is the part that we're at. And we must assert that fact, that Black life matters. We must assert, which means we must assert for each and every one of us that I matter as that Black life, as that consciousness, and to then work in relationship with every other Black life in terms of that coming together. we have a right to assert the fullness of the one, of the self. And when we do that, then we are moving into those wider relationships which we must be responsive to now on the planet. We must do the work hastily, deliberately, speedily, to do that work of supporting ourselves, our children, our families, learning all that we need to know about our history, claiming the part that we have played in this psycho-spiritual journey. You know, one of the things I write about in my other book, KaAbBa, Building the Lighted Temple, Metaphysical Keys to the Tree of Life, is that we cannot tell the story, the complete story of the psycho-spiritual journey in unfolding consciousness unless we're willing to tell the greatness of the black race, of that African-centered consciousness. Anything that doesn't include that is not the complete story. And so we must do the work of claiming our history and teaching our history and working and moving from that African-centered consciousness, that then we are prepared to then be the stewards that we are and have been of this planet. We are, in our Assyrianization of consciousness, we are stewards of the mineral kingdom, of the vegetable kingdom. You know, look at the destruction that's happening in the mineral kingdom, the vegetable kingdom, the animal kingdom, and the human kingdom. We need to be about the work of what we need to do economically, culturally, spiritually, relationally for ourselves, so that then we can be about the business of helping the earth. Because our earth is in peril now, and it needs us to come to the charge. Our African agency to come into that full African charge and African agency as stewards of this planet.
Rolling 3, 2, 1. Go ahead.
Okay. So in conclusion, today's presentation was just a part of a much wider study and mastery of the wisdom that our African ancestors have given us. And the book Secrets in Race and Consciousness is available on our website, which is www.rrrk.net. And you can order the book there. And in the book, you will also see the way to access and activate the first eye. And what are the steps in that? What does that look like? What does that mean? How do we stand in our African-centered locality, in our part? How do we come into greater relationship with all the other parts? And how do we then see and glimpse the way in this spherical sidedness to stand in this universal consciousness, to have the part, the relationship, and that universal consciousness, which is African consciousness. And so we look to hear from you and to have you order the book. And we also have classes that we'll teach online and in person, Boston.
Reascension into sacredness, all our gathering in. Reascension into sacredness from the four winds, from house.